In the year 1865, in a town still draped in the long shadow of a concluded war, there existed a silent understanding that some discoveries were best left to the quiet hours of the morning. It was a time when death was a familiar neighbor, and the sight of an orphan was so common it barely turned a head. But what was found in the pre-dawn chill of one particular mortuary cellar was not common. It was a violation of an order far older than any war, an unnatural commingling of the living and the dead that would haunt the town for years to come. If you find yourself drawn to the shadowed corners of history, where the official records fall silent and only whispers remain, consider joining our archive. Subscribe, and do not miss the evidence as it is brought to light. The mortician was a man defined by rituals. He had inherited the trade from his father, and with it, a profound respect for the quiet dignity of the dead and the precise, unvarying sequence of tasks required to honor that dignity. Every morning for 22 years, he rose before the sun, lit a single tallow candle, and descended the worn stone steps into the cellar. It was a place of profound cold, a subterranean vault where the chill of the earth itself seemed to seep into the mortar and stone, a cold that even the thickest wool coat could not entirely repel. The air was heavy, layered with the smells of damp soil, carbolic acid, and the faint, sweet, cloying scent of formaldehyde, a smell he no longer noticed, but which clung to his clothes and announced his profession to all he passed on the street. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his only companions, the silent residents of his workspace. He had seen the ravages of disease, the brutality of accident, and the quiet, inevitable surrender of old age. Nothing, he believed, could truly surprise him anymore. He had seen it all. He was, in this belief, tragically mistaken. The descent itself was a part of his morning prayer, a meditation in measured steps. 10 steps down, a sharp turn at the landing, 7 more to the packed earthen floor. The candlelight threw his shadow long and distorted against the stone walls, a silent, hunched giant heralding his own arrival. His boots made no sound on the damp ground, a habit learned over years of respecting the profound silence of the place. The cellar was his domain, orderly and precise. To his left, the empty coffins, stacked according to size, their fresh pine scent, a clean counterpoint to the chemical tang in the air. To his right, his work table, a slab of thick oak scrubbed pale with lye, its surface bearing the faint cartography of countless incisions and stains. And along the far wall, on 3 low wooden pallets, lay his current charges, shrouded in clean linen sheets, awaiting his administrations. He approached them as he always did, with a quiet murmur of greeting, a small acknowledgement of the lives they had lived. It was another of his rituals, a way to remember that these were not mere objects, but had been husbands, mothers, and children. On this morning, however, the ritual was broken. The faint, flickering light of his candle caught an anomaly, a disruption in the familiar tableau of shrouded forms. At first, his tired mind struggled to process the information his eyes were sending. There was a shape that did not belong. Between the shrouded forms of a farmer taken by consumption and an elderly woman who had passed in her sleep, there was a small, dark mass. It was low to the ground, nestled in the narrow space separating the 2 pallets. His first thought, a rational one, was that a stray animal, perhaps a dog seeking shelter from the night's frost, had found its way inside. He took a step closer, raising the candle higher, the flame sputtering in a sudden draft that seemed to emanate from the very stones. The light washed over the shape, and the mortician's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful intake of the cold, heavy air. It was not an animal, it was a child. A boy, curled on his side, His small body fitted perfectly into the space between the two silent forms. He was sleeping, his breathing slow and even. One small, pale hand was tucked beneath his cheek. The other rested lightly on the linen sheet covering the old woman, as if for comfort. He was dressed in worn, oversized trousers and a thin cotton shirt, wholly inadequate for the profound cold of the cellar. Yet, he seemed peaceful, profoundly undisturbed by his surroundings. His face, illuminated by the unsteady candlelight, was calm, almost serene. He was not a stranger to the mortician. He recognized the boy as Lucian Graves, one of the town's many orphans, a child rendered parentless by the recent war and the waves of sickness that followed in its wake. He was a quiet, spectral figure, often seen at the edges of town gatherings, a boy who rarely spoke and never seemed to meet anyone's gaze. For a long moment, the mortician could not move. His mind, so accustomed to the predictable finality of death, could not reconcile the image before him. The serene presence of a living, breathing child nestled between two corpses was a profound and terrifying violation of the natural order. He had spent his life maintaining the sacred boundary between the living and the dead, a boundary that this small boy had not only crossed, but had erased entirely. Seeking solace in the one place the living were meant to fear, the silence in the cellar deepened, pressing in on him. The only sound was the impossibly loud, impossibly steady rhythm of the child's breathing. He lowered the candle, his hand trembling, the wax spilling in hot drops onto the cold floor. He needed to act, to remove the boy, to restore the sanctity of his workspace. But he was paralyzed by a question that rose, unbidden and terrible, from the depths of his soul. Why would a living child choose the company of the dead for comfort? He finally took a hesitant step forward, the sound of his own movement unnaturally loud in the stillness. He reached out a hand to touch the boy's shoulder, expecting him to startle awake, to cry out in fear or confusion. But as his fingers made contact, the boy simply stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and snuggled deeper into his grim cradle, as if the cold, unyielding forms beside him were the most natural and comforting of guardians. The boy's eyes fluttered open, not with alarm, but with a slow, languid awareness. They were dark eyes, and in the wavering candlelight, they seemed to hold a depth of knowledge that no child should possess. There was no fear in them. There was no surprise. He simply looked at the mortician with a placid, unnerving calm, as if the man were the intruder, the one who did not belong in this silent, subterranean world. The mortician drew his hand back as if burned. In that moment, he felt a fear colder and more profound than the cellar's chill. This was not merely a case of a desperate orphan seeking shelter. This was something else, something ancient and deeply wrong. He managed to find his voice, the words emerging as a strained whisper. He told the boy he could not be here, that he had to come upstairs. Lucian did not respond with words. He simply continued to gaze at the mortician, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slowness that was agonizing to watch, he uncurled himself, rising to his feet with a quiet grace that was at odds with his ragged appearance. He did not look back at his strange bedfellows. He simply turned and walked towards the stone steps, his bare feet making no sound on the earthen floor. The mortician followed, the candle held aloft, its light now seeming fragile and insufficient against the oppressive darkness of the place. As he reached the top of the stairs and closed the heavy oak door behind them, sealing the cold and the silence below, he knew that something had irrevocably shifted. He had brought a living boy out of the world of the dead, but he had a chilling certainty that the boy had left something of himself behind, and, more terrifyingly, brought something of the cellar's eternal stillness up with him into the world of the living. The news did not spread through the town like wildfire. It moved more like a fog, a cold, creeping mist that seeped under doorways and through cracks in window frames. The mortician, a man of few words, spoke only to the sheriff, reporting the incident in his typical restrained manner. But the sheriff's deputy was a talker, and the story he told in the general store that morning, over a cup of steaming coffee, was stripped of the mortician's quiet horror and instead embellished with the lurid details that small-town gossip craves. By noon, the story was on everyone's lips, passed in hushed tones between neighbors over backyard fences, whispered by women in the mercantile, and debated by men on the steps of the post office. The story changed with each telling, becoming more monstrous, more unnatural. The boy had not simply been sleeping, some said. He had been conversing with the dead. He had been found with a rime of frost on his hair, yet his skin was not cold. He had smiled when the mortician woke him, a knowing, secret smile. Lucian Graves, who had once been merely an object of pity, a sad, ignorable byproduct of the town's collective tragedies, was transformed into something else entirely. He became a figure of morbid fascination and deep, primal unease. Parents pulled their own children closer when he passed, his spectral presence now casting a far darker shadow. The other orphans, who had once simply ignored him, now actively shunned him, their childhood cruelty sharpened by a new, more potent fear. They gave him a new name, a name whispered in the schoolyard and scrawled on the side of the orphanage wall, the boy who rests with the dead. The townspeople, a community bound by shared hardship and a rigid, unspoken set of beliefs about the proper order of things, were forced to confront a reality that lay far outside their experience. They understood death, they understood grief, they understood the plight of an orphan. What they could not understand, what they could not accept, was a child who did not seem to recognize the boundary between life and death, a child who sought warmth not from the living, but from the cold, final embrace of the deceased. The core question that had paralyzed the mortician in the icy stillness of his cellar now echoed silently in the minds of the entire community. Why? Why would a child choose such a place? Was it a simple, desperate search for shelter, a tragic but ultimately rational act? Or was it a sign of something far more disturbing, a sickness of the mind, or, as the more superstitious among them whispered in the pews on Sunday, a sickness of the soul? This incident, this discovery in the pre-dawn gloom, became a crack in the town's carefully constructed reality, a fissure through which a host of older, darker fears began to emerge. The story of Lucian Graves ceased to be about a single, unfortunate boy. It became a story about the fragility of the veil between worlds, a chilling reminder that there are some things that do not abide by the rules of God or man. And as the days turned into weeks, a new, more unsettling rumor began to circulate. A whisper that suggested the discovery in the mortuary cellar was not the first time Lucian Graves had been found lingering in places where the living had no right to be. It was merely the first time he had been caught. The town, having found its monster, now began the slow, inexorable process of searching for its origins, desperate to understand the nature of the unnatural child who walked among them. The discovery of the boy in the cellar created a wound in the town's collective psyche, and like any wound left untended, it began to fester. Pity curdled into suspicion, and suspicion gave way to a quiet, creeping fear. The community, in its desperate need for order and explanation, turned to the institutions that had always provided them, the law and the church. The town sheriff, a practical man more accustomed to settling disputes over livestock than confronting matters of supernatural dread, found himself at a loss. The boy had committed no crime. Trespassing was the only possible charge, and in the case of a homeless orphan seeking shelter, it was a charge no one had the heart to levy. Yet, the image of the child sleeping peacefully among the dead could not be dismissed. It was a transgression against an unwritten law, a law of nature, and it demanded an accounting. It was this need for answers, for a history that could explain the boy's unnatural affinities, that led the sheriff to the parish rectory, to the one man in town whose entire life was dedicated to keeping the records of life and death in their proper, sanctified order. The parish priest was an elderly man, his back bent from years of leaning over his ledgers and his Bible. His world was one of ink and parchment, of names and dates meticulously recorded in a steady, spidery hand. He believed that a life, from its first cry at baptism to its final amen at the graveside, could be charted and understood through these sacred archives. When the sheriff presented him with the story of Lucian Graves, the priest was initially dismissive, attributing the boy's behavior to the profound trauma of orphanhood. He was confident that a simple review of his records would ground the boy in a recognizable history, providing the names of his parents, the date of his birth, and the tragic but ordinary circumstances that had left him alone. He led the sheriff into his study, a small, cramped room that smelled of aging paper, beeswax, and damp wool. Sunlight struggled through a single, grime-streaked window, illuminating swirling motes of dust in its pale beams. The priest, after carefully polishing his spectacles with a linen cloth, retrieved the baptismal ledger for the past decade. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume, its corners worn smooth with time, and its pages as thin and delicate as dried leaves. The priest opened it with a reverence usually reserved for scripture, the spine cracking in the quiet room. His long, bony finger, the nail yellowed with age, began to trace the columns of names. He was a methodical man, and he began his search in the year the war ended, moving backward, page by page. The sheriff stood by, his hat in his hands, watching the slow, deliberate process. The silence in the room was broken only by the dry rustle of turning pages and the priest's soft, occasional murmur as he read a familiar name. An hour passed. The priest worked his way through 1864, 1863, and beyond, his confidence slowly beginning to fray at the edges. The name Lucian Graves was nowhere to be found. There was no record of his baptism, no mention of his parents as sponsors for another child, no trace of his family in the weekly collections or the marriage logs. A frown creased the priest's brow. He set aside the baptismal records and retrieved the Book of Births, a civic document he was required to maintain. Again, he began the search. Again, he found nothing. The boy, it seemed, had not been born in their parish. At least, not officially. The priest's movements became less certain, his hand now hesitating before turning each page. He was confronting something he had never before encountered in his long service, a complete and total archival silence. It was as if the boy had simply materialized, without origin, without family, without a single mark in the sacred and civic books that testified to a person's existence. The sheriff, sensing the priest's growing agitation, asked if it was possible the family was not of their faith, or that they had simply passed through. The priest conceded that it was possible, but he knew every family in the surrounding townships, and the name Graves was unknown to him. It was then, as he sat staring at the blank space where a life should have been recorded, that a memory surfaced in the old priest's mind. It was a memory from several years prior, from the terrible autumn of the influenza, a time when the church bell had tolled almost without ceasing. He remembered a child found in the churchyard, a child with no name. The priest's narrative, when he finally gave it voice, was tinged with the melancholy of that dreadful season. It had been a time of pervasive dampness, a constant, chilling rain that seemed to wash the color from the world and turn the churchyard into a sea of mud and misery. The epidemic had moved through the town with a swift and merciless efficiency, leaving a trail of fresh graves in its wake. The gravedigger, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the local clay, had been working from dawn until dusk, his shovel a grim metronome marking the town's losses. It was this man who had found him. At the end of a long day of burials, as twilight bled across the bruised purple sky, the gravedigger had seen a small, still shape near the new section of the cemetery, where the earth was a raw, open wound. He had assumed, as the mortician later would, that it was a stray dog. But as he drew closer, his lantern casting a swinging, distorted circle of light, he saw that it was a boy, no older than 5 or 6, sitting on the damp ground between 2 freshly mounded graves. He was not crying. He was not shivering from the cold, though his clothes were thin and soaked through with the persistent rain. He was simply sitting there, his small hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the dark, overturned soil. The gravedigger, a man hardened by his daily commerce with grief, was profoundly unsettled. He said the boy seemed not lost, but patient, as if he were keeping a vigil, or perhaps waiting for the occupants of the graves to return. When the man spoke to him, the boy did not answer. He did not seem to hear him at all. He eventually had to lift the child into his arms and carry him to the rectory. The priest remembered the boy's unnerving stillness, the way his dark eyes seemed to look through him, not at him. They had asked him his name, who his parents were, where he had come from. The child had remained silent, a small, enigmatic vessel of sorrow. It was the priest who, after days of fruitless inquiry throughout the county, had named him. He called him Lucian, for light, in the desperate hope of dispelling the shadows that seemed to cling to him. And he called him Graves, for the place where he had been found, a name that now, in light of the incident in the mortuary cellar, seemed less like a simple descriptor and more like a grim prophecy. With this piece of the puzzle unearthed, the sheriff and the priest next sought out the woman who had cared for Lucian since that day, the orphan caretaker. She was a stern, weary woman who ran the town orphanage, a grim, overcrowded institution housed in a former tannery, a place that never quite lost the chemical bite of its former purpose. Her hands were red and chapped from the constant washing of linens in harsh lye soap, and her face was a mask of perpetual exhaustion. When she spoke of Lucian, it was with a mixture of detached pity and a deep, unshakable unease. She confirmed the priest's account. Lucian had arrived as a silent, watchful presence, and in the years that followed, he had remained so. He never cried, she reported, not even when the older boys, with their casual cruelty, would take his meager portion of food. He never played. While the other children engaged in the loud, chaotic games of youth, Lucian would stand apart, often near a window, watching the world outside with a profound and unnerving stillness. It was his fascination with funerals, however, that she described with the most trepidation. She told the sheriff that any time the church bell began to toll for a death, Lucian would stop whatever he was doing. He would be drawn to the nearest window, his small face pressed against the glass, and he would watch with an intensity that was wholly different from the fleeting, morbid curiosity of the other children. He would follow the slow, black procession of the hearse and the mourners with his eyes until it disappeared from view. On several occasions, he had slipped out of the orphanage, and she had later found him at the edge of the cemetery, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, observing the burial rites from a distance. He was not grieving. His expression was not one of sadness. It was one of intense, focused interest, almost like a scholar observing a complex and fascinating ritual. She said she had punished him for it, trying to explain that it was disrespectful, that the cemetery was a place of sorrow for the living. He had simply looked at her, his dark eyes placid and uncomprehending, as if she were speaking a foreign language. Her testimony painted a disturbing portrait, not of a troubled child, but of a child with a fundamentally different orientation to the world. A child whose compass pointed not towards the warmth and noise of life, but towards the quiet, cold finality of the grave. This investigation into Lucian's origins did not provide the comfort the town had sought. It did the opposite. It stripped away the possibility of a simple, tragic explanation and replaced it with a profound and terrifying mystery. The boy had no past, no family, no recorded entry into the world. He had appeared in a graveyard in the midst of an epidemic, a silent spectator to death, and had spent the subsequent years as a ghost in their midst, his only apparent interest the rituals of passing. The question that now hung heavy in the damp autumn air was no longer simply why he slept among the dead. It was a darker, more fundamental question. Was Lucian Graves truly an orphan, a boy abandoned to the cruelties of fate, or was he something else? Had he been abandoned for a reason? Had his parents, whoever they were, seen the same chilling affinity in him, the same unnatural pull towards the grave, and left him there, in the one place he seemed to truly belong? The town's curiosity had run its course. It was now being replaced by a much older and more dangerous emotion: fear. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the unnatural, and the growing conviction that the strange, silent boy in their care was not a child to be pitied, but a presence to be deeply, deeply feared. The search for Lucian's origins had yielded not answers, but a deeper and more unsettling mystery, a void where a history should have been. This absence of a past, combined with his now infamous discovery in the mortuary, transformed him from a figure of curiosity into a vessel for the town's burgeoning anxieties. The fear was no longer confined to hushed whispers and sidelong glances. It became an active, palpable presence in the community, a contagion of unease that spread from house to house, altering the familiar rhythms of daily life. Lucian, who had always been a peripheral figure, was now thrust into the center of the town's collective consciousness. His every movement, every silent glance, was catalogued, scrutinized, and interpreted through a new lens of dread. What had once been seen as the tragic peculiarities of a traumatized child were now viewed as unnatural patterns, a series of small, disquieting behaviors that hinted at a profound and terrifying kinship with the dead. The most disturbing of these new patterns was his uncanny knowledge of the town's mortuary rituals. The mortician, now deeply unnerved by the boy's presence, reported that Lucian had begun to shadow him. He would appear as if from nowhere, standing silently at the edge of the mortuary grounds, his small form almost invisible against the gray, weathered wood of the building. He would watch the mortician unload a new arrival from the back of his cart, his dark eyes following every step of the grim process with a focused, almost academic, intensity. He never tried to enter the building again, but his constant, silent vigil was in many ways more unsettling. It was the mortician's wife who first noticed the boy's strange mimicry. She told her neighbors that she had seen Lucian in the field behind their house, standing over a dead bird. He was not playing, he was performing a ritual. His small hands were clasped behind his back in the exact manner of the mortician, and his head was bowed. His lips were moving, and though she could not hear the words, she saw that he was reciting something, his expression one of solemn gravity. It was a perfect, silent imitation of the prayers the mortician offered for the dead. This mimicry soon escalated into something far stranger. The parish priest, during one of his weekly visits to the orphanage, encountered Lucian sitting alone on the back steps. The priest, still troubled by the boy's archival void, attempted to engage him in conversation, asking him simple questions about his day. Lucian, as usual, did not respond. But then, unprompted, he looked up at the priest, his gaze direct and unnervingly clear, and he began to speak. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but the words he uttered sent a chill down the old man's spine. The boy began to recite the details of the death of a local blacksmith who had passed away 2 days prior from a sudden, violent ailment of the heart. He described the man's final moments, the specific words he had spoken to his wife, the precise manner of his collapse. These were intimate, private details that Lucian could not possibly have witnessed, details that were known only to the blacksmith's grieving family and to the priest himself, who had been there to administer the last rites. The priest was stunned into silence. He asked the boy how he could know such things. Lucian simply fell silent again, his gaze dropping to the ground, the connection broken as abruptly as it had been established. The priest left the orphanage that day with a new and terrible conviction. The boy was not merely an observer of death. He was, in some inexplicable way, a receiver of its secrets. The townspeople, too, began to report their own unsettling encounters. A woman, recently widowed, was woken in the dead of night by a sound at her window. When she drew back the curtain, her heart pounding in her chest, she saw Lucian's pale face looking in, his expression not malicious, but blank and watchful. He was simply there, a silent sentinel in the darkness, standing outside the home where a death had just occurred. He did not move or speak, he just watched. When her terrified scream brought her son running into the room, the boy was gone, vanished as silently as he had appeared. Her story was not unique. A farmer, whose father had passed away in his sleep, found small, bare footprints in the frost-covered mud beneath his father's bedroom window the next morning. A young mother, whose infant had been taken by a sudden fever, swore she saw a small, shadowy figure standing at the foot of her driveway in the pre-dawn gloom, a silent witness to her family's grief. These incidents were never threatening in an overt way. There was no violence, no malice. But it was this very passivity, this silent, persistent proximity to their sorrow, that the townspeople found so deeply disturbing. It felt like a form of contamination, as if the boy were drawn to their grief like a moth to a flame, feeding on the very atmosphere of death that permeated their homes. The children of the town, with their unvarnished honesty and primal instincts, were the first to give a name to the fear their parents felt. They had always been wary of Lucian, but now their wariness hardened into outright hostility and terror. They refused to play anywhere near the orphanage, their games falling silent if Lucian happened to wander into view. They would cross the street to avoid him, their whispered insults like thrown stones. They called him corpse-kin, a cruel but strangely apt descriptor for a child who seemed more comfortable with the dead than the living. One schoolteacher reported an incident that crystallized this childhood fear. She had found a group of older boys taunting Lucian in the schoolyard. They had formed a circle around him, chanting the name corpse-kin over and over. Lucian, as was his way, did not react. He simply stood in the center of their circle, his gaze fixed on some distant point, seemingly oblivious to their cruelty. The teacher, angered by their behavior, disciplined the boys and later asked one of them why they were so afraid of Lucian. The boy, his face pale, could not offer a rational explanation. He simply said that being near Lucian felt cold, a deep, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He said that when Lucian looked at you, it felt as if he were looking at your bones, at the part of you that would one day be in the ground. The town's social fabric, already frayed by war and disease, began to tear under the strain of this new, inexplicable fear. The unease was constant, a low hum of anxiety that underscored every public gathering and private conversation. The tolling of the church bell, once a simple announcement of a soul's passing, now carried a new and ominous significance. It was no longer just a marker of death, it was a potential summons for Lucien, a signal that might draw his silent, watchful presence to another grieving home. The central question that plagued the community shifted. It was no longer a question of origins, of who Lucien was, or where he had come from. The question now was far more urgent, far more terrifying. What was he? Was his strange affinity for the dead a passive, harmless aberration, a form of profound, misunderstood grief? Or was it something more active, more sinister? Did death merely draw him, or, in some way they could not comprehend, did he draw death? The small, inexplicable details, the anomalous behaviors, had accumulated, each one another piece of evidence, in an unspoken and terrifying indictment. The whispers in the alleyways grew louder, the shadows at the windows seemed to hold a more definite shape, and the town's collective fear began its slow, inexorable crystallization into a single, terrible resolve. The patterns of unease could no longer be tolerated. Something had to be done. The patterns of unease had coalesced into a singular, suffocating cloud of dread that hung over the town, poisoning the very air. Fear, once a private whisper, had become a public mandate. The community, desperate to reassert the known and rational order of the world, turned to its pillars of authority, demanding that the anomaly of Lucien Graves be contained, explained, or purged. The time for observation was over. The time for intervention had begun. The first to be called upon was the town doctor, a man whose entire worldview was built upon the unshakable foundations of logic, anatomy, and the observable mechanics of the human body. He was a pragmatist, a man of science who believed that every ailment, whether of the mind or the flesh, had a physical cause and a rational explanation. He dismissed the town's talk of the boy being corpse-kin as the predictable hysteria of an uneducated populace, the same kind of superstitious nonsense that led people to trust poultices and prayer over surgery and sanitation. He agreed to examine the boy, confident that he would find a simple, medical explanation for his behavior, perhaps a neurological affliction, a form of melancholia brought on by severe trauma, or even a subtle malnourishment that affected his temperament. The examination took place in the doctor's small, sterile surgery, a room that smelled sharply of carbolic acid and rubbing alcohol. The instruments of his trade were laid out in neat, gleaming rows on a wooden tray, scalpels, probes, and a brand new stethoscope he had ordered from Boston. Lucien was brought in by the sheriff, and he entered the room with his usual preternatural calm, his dark eyes taking in the strange metallic objects without a flicker of fear or curiosity. The doctor, a man with a professionally cheerful and disarming bedside manner he used to soothe frightened children, found his usual techniques were useless. He spoke to Lucien in a soft, encouraging voice, but the boy offered no response. He was not defiant or shy. He was simply absent, his consciousness seemingly operating on a plane that the doctor's friendly overtures could not reach. The doctor began his physical examination, his movements efficient and practiced. He was, at his core, a cartographer of the human body, and he set about mapping Lucien's small frame with a detached, scientific rigor. He noted the boy's low body temperature, a few degrees below what he would consider normal, but not alarmingly so. He recorded his height and weight, both of which were slightly below average for a boy of his estimated age. He checked his reflexes, tapping his knees with a small rubber mallet, and was surprised by the sluggishness of the response. It was the examination of the boy's vital signs, however, that gave the doctor his first true pause. He pressed the cold, metal bell of his stethoscope to Lucian's chest, expecting to hear the familiar, rhythmic gallop of a child's heart. Instead, he heard a beat that was unnervingly slow, methodical, and faint, more akin to the languid pulse of a man in the deepest stages of sleep or a hibernating animal. It was a living heart, but it seemed to beat with a profound and unnatural economy, as if conserving its energy for some long, unspecified duration. He listened for a long time, the silence of the room amplifying the slow, deliberate thump-thump in his ears. It was the sound of life, but it was a sound stripped of all vitality, all urgency. He moved on, peering into the boy's eyes with a small, focused beam of light from a polished reflector. He expected the pupils to contract sharply, the normal, involuntary response to a sudden brightness. Lucian's pupils did contract, but they did so with a strange, liquid slowness, a reluctant closing that seemed more like a deliberate act than a neurological reflex. And the eyes themselves were deeply unsettling. The doctor was accustomed to looking into the eyes of his patients and seeing a reflection of their inner state: fear, pain, hope, or despair. When he looked into Lucian's eyes, he saw nothing. It was like looking down a deep, dark well. There was an unnerving stillness there, a complete absence of the thousand tiny, unconscious movements and flickers that signify a thinking, feeling mind. He found no physical illness, no sign of disease or injury. The boy was, by all medical definitions, perfectly healthy. Yet, the doctor felt a growing sense of profound wrongness. His final report to the town council was a document of professional frustration. He stated, in precise, clinical terms, that he could find no physiological explanation for the boy's behavior. He concluded his report with a sentence that he would later regret, a sentence that abandoned the sterile language of medicine and strayed into the realm of the poetic and the terrified. He wrote that while the boy was medically alive, he possessed a stillness of pulse and eye that was more consistent with a body that had already resolved itself to the grave. The doctor's failure to provide a rational explanation only deepened the town's fear. If the boy's affliction was not of the body, then it must be something else, something that could not be measured or contained by conventional means. The town elders, led by the sheriff, decided on a more direct course of action. They resolved to control the boy's movements, to sever his connection to the places of death he seemed to frequent. They would lock him away overnight, a simple, practical solution to prove that he was, after all, just a child of flesh and bone, subject to the same physical laws as everyone else. They chose a small, secure room in the back of the sheriff's office, a temporary holding cell with a thick oak door and a single, high window barred with iron. The orphan caretaker brought Lucy into the office just as dusk was settling, the sky outside streaked with orange and violet. Lucian entered the cell without resistance, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the grim-faced men who watched him. He surveyed the small, bare room with its simple cot and then sat down, his hands folded in his lap. He seemed utterly untroubled by his confinement. The sheriff, a man who felt a pang of guilt for locking up a child, tried to explain that it was for his own good. Lucian simply looked at him with those same vacant, placid eyes. The sheriff closed the heavy door, the sound echoing in the quiet office. He turned the large iron key in the lock, the series of loud, metallic clicks sounding unnervingly final. He slid the bolt across for good measure. He stood there for a moment, listening. He could hear no sound from within the room, no crying, no protest. Just a profound and complete silence. The sheriff felt a measure of relief. The problem, he believed, was contained. He would keep a watch through the night, and in the morning, they would have proven their point. The boy was just a boy. The mortuary cellar would remain undisturbed. The natural order would be restored. The next morning, the mortician rose before dawn, as was his custom. He carried with him a new and unfamiliar feeling, a sense of fragile hope. He knew the boy was locked away, and he prayed that this simple act of confinement would break the strange, unholy pattern that had disrupted his life and his sacred work. He lit his candle, his hand steady for the first time in weeks, and began his descent down the 10 stone steps. He turned at the landing and took the final 7 steps to the earthen floor. He raised his candle, its small, brave flame pushing back the oppressive darkness, and then he froze, the hope in his heart turning to ice. He was there. Lucian was standing by the far wall, next to the pallets, his back to the mortician. He was not sleeping this time. He was standing perfectly still, his head slightly bowed, as if in silent communion with the shrouded forms that lay there. The air in the cellar seemed impossibly cold, impossibly still. The mortician let out a small, involuntary cry, a sound of pure, abject terror. Lucian turned slowly, his movements fluid and unhurried. He looked at the mortician, and on his face was the faintest trace of what looked like disappointment, as if the man had interrupted a private and important moment. The sheriff, when he was summoned, could not believe it. He had been awake most of the night, sitting in his office, and had heard nothing. He rushed to the cell, the iron key trembling in his hand. The bolt was still shot, the lock was still secure. He threw open the door to reveal an empty room. The cot was undisturbed, the single barred window was untouched. There was no sign of escape, no possible means by which a child could have passed through a bolted door and a locked building. The rational world, with its locks and keys and physical barriers, had failed. The town's last bastion of order had been effortlessly breached by a silent, inexplicable child. There was only one remaining authority to turn to, one final power that could be brought to bear against a force that was clearly not of this world. They turned to the church. The parish priest, his face grim and his faith shaken, agreed that a spiritual intervention was necessary. He did not call it an exorcism, a word too sensational and terrifying for the small, frightened gathering of town elders who assembled in the nave of the church. He called it a cleansing rite, an appeal to God to purify the boy of whatever shadow had fallen upon him. They brought Lucian to the church in the late afternoon. The light slanting through the stained glass windows painted the stone floor in jewels of red and blue and gold. The air was thick with the scent of old incense and melting beeswax. The priest, dressed in his solemn vestments, stood before the altar, a Bible in one hand and an aspergillum for the holy water in the other. He began the rite, his voice strong at first, filling the cavernous space with the ancient, powerful cadences of Latin. He spoke the words of purification, the prayers designed to drive out darkness and restore the sanctity of a baptized soul. He expected a reaction. He expected the boy to cry out, to recoil from the holy water, to show some sign of the unholy presence that afflicted him. Lucian did none of these things. He stood before the priest, his small hands at his sides, his expression one of serene and patient attention. When the priest sprinkled him with holy water, he did not flinch. The drops clung to his dark hair like tiny diamonds, and he simply blinked slowly, as if a gentle rain had begun to fall. And then, the moment of ultimate horror arrived. The priest began a section of the rite that involved a responsive prayer, a litany that was a dialogue between the clergy and the congregation. As the priest spoke the first line in Latin, he paused, expecting the customary silence. Instead, from the small boy before him, a voice emerged. It was a soft, clear voice, and it spoke the ancient words of the response in flawless, unaccented Latin. The priest faltered, his own words catching in his throat. He stared at the boy, whose eyes were now closed, as if in deep concentration. He continued the rite, his voice now trembling, and each time he paused for the response, Lucien provided it, his timing perfect, his pronunciation that of a seasoned scholar, not a child who had never been taught the language. The elders watching from the pews gasped, one of the men making the sign of the cross over and over. This was not a demon reacting with rage. This was something far more terrifying. This was a presence that knew their rituals, that understood their sacred language, and that was not repelled by their faith, but seemed to be an ancient participant in it. The priest's prayers had no power here. Their God was silent. Their rituals were empty. They had tried to confine the boy with stone and iron, and failed. They had tried to cleanse him with faith and holy water, and failed. They had exhausted all their earthly and spiritual authority, and in the end, they were left with nothing but their own terror and the chilling, unanswered question. What do you do with a child who is more at home with the dead than the living, and who cannot be contained by either the laws of man or the grace of God? The failure of the cleansing rite marked a final, terrifying turning point. The town had exhausted its established systems of control and comprehension. The doctor's science, the sheriff's law, and the priest's faith had all proven impotent against the silent, inexplicable nature of Lucien Graves. The boy's effortless escape from a locked cell and his serene, knowledgeable participation in the rite that was meant to purge him shattered the last vestiges of the community's rational worldview. He was not a troubled child, nor was he merely possessed. He was something other, an entity that operated outside the boundaries of their understanding, and the fear he inspired now mutated into something darker and far more dangerous, a primal, collective panic. This panic needed a focus, a narrative to make sense of the dread that now permeated every corner of their lives, and in the days that followed the failed cleansing, a new and terrible logic began to take hold. If Lucien was not merely drawn to death, then he must be its agent. He was not a spectator, he was a catalyst, a harbinger, a walking curse whose very presence was an invitation to the grave. This nascent conviction was fanned into a raging fire by a series of events that, in any other time, might have been seen as tragic coincidences. But in the superheated atmosphere of the town's fear, they were seen as undeniable proof of Lucien's malevolence. An elderly farmer, a man who had been in robust health, collapsed in his field, his heart suddenly and inexplicably silenced. His wife, distraught with grief, told the sheriff that she had seen Lucien standing on the road near their property the previous evening, a small, still figure watching the sunset. 2 days later, the baker's young son, who had been suffering from a mild cough, took a sudden turn for the worse, his lungs filling with fluid, and he was dead by morning. The baker, his eyes red-rimmed and wild with sorrow and rage, stormed into the sheriff's office, swearing that he had seen the orphan boy looking into the window of his son's bedroom the night before the fever broke. A third death followed swiftly, a young woman who died in childbirth, taking her infant son with her. The story spread that Lucien had been seen near the town well when the woman's husband was drawing water for her just hours before the labor began. Each death was a hammer blow, forging a chain of causation in the minds of the townspeople, linking the boy's silent appearances to the subsequent tragedies. He became a specter of death, his presence a certain omen of a coming loss. The grief and helplessness of the community, their inability to control the random cruelties of fate, found a target. It was easier to believe in a curse that could be seen and named than to accept the terrifying randomness of mortality. Lucien became the focus of all their sorrow, all their fear, and all their rage. The whispers that had once followed him down the street were replaced by open accusations. Women would snatch their children indoors when he approached. Men would stop their conversations and stare at him with a cold, hard hatred. The very air around him seemed to crackle with the town's collective animosity. The question of what to do with the boy was no longer a matter for quiet debate among the town elders. It became the single, urgent topic of conversation in every home, every shop, every corner of the community. The town's judgment was coming, and it was gathering with the speed and force of a summer storm. The tipping point came on a cold, windswept evening, a week after the third death. The parish priest, seeing the escalating tension and fearing that the town was on the verge of succumbing to mob violence, called for a public gathering at the parish hall. His intention was to appeal for calm, for reason, for Christian charity. He hoped to steer the community away from the dark path it was heading down. His efforts were a catastrophic failure. The parish hall, a large, drafty building with a high, vaulted ceiling, was filled to capacity. The entire town seemed to be there, their faces illuminated by the flickering, unsteady light of dozens of tallow candles, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, candle smoke, and a palpable, almost electric, sense of collective fear and anger. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, their individual anxieties merging into a single, powerful entity. This was no longer a collection of neighbors. It was a mob, united by a shared terror and a burning need for resolution. The priest stood on a small, raised platform at the front of the hall, his voice, usually so resonant and commanding from the pulpit, now seeming thin and reedy against the low, angry murmur of the crowd. He spoke of compassion, of the plight of an orphan, of the dangers of succumbing to superstition. His words were met with stony silence, then with open grumbling. A man from the back of the hall, the blacksmith's brother, shouted out, his voice raw with grief, that it was not superstition that had taken his brother, but the boy's curse. The baker, his face a mask of tragedy, stood and pointed a trembling finger at the priest, accusing him of protecting a devil in their midst. The dam of civility broke. Voices rose from all corners of the hall, a chaotic chorus of accusation and fear. People recounted the stories of Lucian's appearances, each tale reinforcing the others, building a narrative of undeniable, supernatural malice. The doctor tried to intervene, to speak of the lack of evidence, of the dangers of mass hysteria, but his rational, scientific words were drowned out by the emotional, terrified shouts of his neighbors. He was a man trying to lecture on the principles of meteorology in the heart of a hurricane. In the midst of this escalating chaos, the main doors of the parish hall creaked open. A gust of cold, wet wind swept through the room, causing the candles to gutter and plunging the hall into a moment of near darkness. Standing silhouetted in the doorway was the sheriff, and beside him, a small, still figure. He had brought Lucian. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a profound and sudden silence. The angry shouts died in people's throats. The mob, so loud and confident in its righteous fury, was momentarily stunned by the actual presence of its object of hatred. The sheriff, his face grim, led the boy through the crowd, which parted before him as if he were leading a leper. They walked to the front of the hall, and the sheriff stood Lucian before the raised platform, forcing him to face the silent, accusing eyes of the entire town. The boy, as always, seemed utterly unaffected by the suffocating atmosphere of animosity. He stood there, his small hands at his sides, his gaze not fixed on any one person, but directed somewhere into the middle distance, as if he were observing a scene in which he was not a participant. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind outside and the sputtering of the candles. The priest, his face pale, looked down at the child, his heart torn between his faith in God's mercy and the terrifying evidence of his own senses. The sheriff, his hand resting on the wooden handle of his pistol, felt not like a keeper of the law, but like a jailer presenting a condemned prisoner. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy with unspoken threats. It was the blacksmith's widow who finally broke it. Her voice, choked with tears, cut through the stillness. She asked the boy, her question a simple, desperate plea for understanding, why he had been there, why he had watched her husband die. The question hung in the air, a direct address to the silent, enigmatic child at the center of their storm. And then, the impossible happened. Lucian Graves, who had been silent for days, who had never offered a word of explanation for his actions, spoke. His voice was not loud, but in the absolute silence of the hall, it carried to every corner, every rafter. It was a child's voice, clear and untroubled, yet the words he spoke were not the words of a child. He turned his head slowly, his dark, placid eyes sweeping across the sea of fearful, hostile faces before him. He looked at the grieving widow, at the heartbroken baker, at the priest on his platform, and at the sheriff by his side. And then he said, his voice imbued with a simple, factual certainty, a statement of a truth so profound and so alien that it shattered the last remnants of their world. He said, "They are warmer than you." The words fell into the silence of the room like stones into a deep, cold lake. A wave of shock, of incomprehension, of pure, undiluted horror washed over the crowd. They had expected a confession, a denial, a plea for mercy, or perhaps just the continued, unnerving silence. They were not prepared for this. It was an answer that was not an answer, a statement that recontextualized everything they thought they knew. He had not sought out the dead because of a sickness or a curse. He had sought them out for comfort, for a quality he found in them that was absent in the living: warmth. The word itself was a judgment, a terrible and damning indictment of every person in that room. In that one simple sentence, Lucian declared that the cold, final stillness of the grave was preferable to the company of the living. The townspeople stared at him, their anger momentarily eclipsed by a chilling, collective self-awareness. They looked at their own hands, clenched into fists, at the hatred in the eyes of their neighbors, at the mob they had become. Were they cold? Was the living world they had built, with its grief and its rage and its fear, a place colder than the tomb? The question, his question, hung in the candlelit air, an accusation from which there was no defense. The town had gathered to pass judgment on the boy, but in the end, it was the boy who had, with 4 simple words, passed a judgment far more terrible on them. The boy's words, "They are warmer than you," did not incite the immediate violence that the sheriff had feared. Instead, they plunged the hall into a state of stunned, horrified paralysis. The statement was so profoundly alien, so utterly outside the realm of human sentiment, that the town's collective rage was momentarily extinguished, replaced by a deep, psychic chill. It was the response of a creature for whom the fundamental values of life and death, of warmth and cold, were inverted. The people of the town looked at the small, still child before them, and for the first time, they did not see a cursed boy or a bringer of death. They saw something they could not name, a being whose nature was so fundamentally different from their own as to be utterly incomprehensible. The judgment they had been so eager to render now seemed not only inadequate but absurd. How could you punish something that did not fear the grave, but in fact preferred its company? How could you exile a creature who was already, in some essential way, an exile from the entire world of the living? The meeting in the parish hall dissolved not with a roar, but with a slow, silent emptying. The townspeople filed out into the cold, wind-swept night, not speaking to one another, their faces pale and drawn in the moonlight. They retreated to their homes, barred their doors, and huddled close to their hearths, seeking a warmth that suddenly felt fragile and precarious. They had confronted the unnatural, and it had held up a mirror to them, a mirror that reflected a coldness in their own hearts they had never wished to see. They had been left with a far more terrifying fear than before, the fear that the boy was not a monster in their midst, but a consequence, a reaction to a world that had become too cold to support the warmth of a normal life. The sheriff took Lucien back to the small, empty cell, but he did not lock the door. The act now seemed utterly pointless. What prison could hold a child who could walk through walls and who found no solace in the company of the living? What happened to Lucien Graves in the hours that followed remains a matter of folklore, a story that splintered into a dozen different versions, each whispered with the same chilling uncertainty. The official account, the one recorded by the sheriff in his logbook, is a masterpiece of brevity and evasion. It simply states that on the morning of October the 28th, 1865, the boy known as Lucien Graves was discovered to be missing from his temporary holding, and that a subsequent search of the town and the surrounding countryside yielded no trace of him. He had, according to the law, simply vanished. But the unofficial stories, the ones told over flickering tavern fires and in hushed tones by grandmothers to their grandchildren, are far more elaborate and far more enduring. One version claims that the mortician, driven by a mixture of terror and a strange, lingering pity, rose in the middle of the night and went to the sheriff's office. He found Lucien sitting awake on his cot, staring at the barred window through which a sliver of pale moonlight fell. The mortician, without a word, was said to have opened the cell door and led the boy out into the deserted, muddy streets of the town. He walked him to the edge of the cemetery, to the old, crumbling lich gate that marked the entrance to the realm of the dead. There, he stopped and simply pointed towards the silent, sleeping stones. Lucien, the story goes, looked up at the old man, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He then turned and walked through the gate, his small form swallowed by the deep shadows of the yew trees, and was never seen again. He had, in this telling, been returned to his rightful home, a willing departure into the kingdom he had always sought. Another, darker version of the story insists that a small group of men, led by the baker and the blacksmith's brother, could not let the boy's judgment stand. Their grief and rage, temporarily stunned into silence, had rekindled in the long, dark hours of the night. Unwilling to trust the authorities, they took matters into their own hands. This version of the tale claims they went to the jail, forced the sheriff aside, and took the boy from his cell. They did not kill him, for the act of shedding a child's blood was a line even they would not cross. Instead, they took him deep into the oldest part of the surrounding woods, to a place where the trees grew so thick that the sunlight never reached the forest floor. They left him there, in the cold and the dark, a final, cruel act of exile. They returned to the town, believing they had purged their community of its curse. But this version of the story always ends with a chilling addendum, that for years afterward, hunters and trappers would report finding strange signs in that part of the forest, small, bare footprints that led nowhere, and a profound, unnatural stillness among the trees, a cold spot where no birds would sing and no animal would tread. Regardless of which version one chooses to believe, the result was the same. Lucien Graves was gone. His physical presence was erased from the town as completely as his name was absent from its birth records. But his absence proved to be a far more powerful and enduring haunt than his presence had ever been. The town, which had so desperately sought a return to normalcy, found that the quiet, watchful boy had changed them in ways that could not be undone. A strange, collective guilt settled over the community, a shared, unspoken shame for their fear and their hatred. They had been judged by a child and found wanting, and this knowledge soured their interactions and cast a long shadow over their faith. The town did not heal, it scarred. The most tangible legacy of Lucian's time among them was the fate of the mortuary cellar. Shortly after the boy's disappearance, the mortician, a man now visibly aged and broken by his experiences, sealed the stone steps that led down to the cellar. He had a new door of thick, reinforced oak built at the top of the stairs, and he barred it with a heavy iron cross that the blacksmith forged for him, a symbol of both faith and finality. He began using a back room on the ground floor for his work, unable to bear the profound, watchful cold that now seemed to emanate from the stones below. But the ceiling of the cellar did not bring peace. For the rest of his life, the mortician would complain of sounds from beneath the floorboards. He would hear, in the dead of night, what he swore was the sound of slow, measured footsteps on the packed earthen floor of the sealed room. Sometimes, he would hear a soft, murmuring sound, like a child whispering in his sleep. His wife, and later his son, who inherited the business, heard nothing and attributed the sounds to the grief and strain that had unsettled the old man's mind. But the mortician was not the only one. For generations, the townspeople who lived near the mortuary would report strange occurrences. They would speak of a faint, flickering light, like a single candle, sometimes seen through the cellar's grimy, ground-level windows, despite the fact that the room had been empty and sealed for decades. And the town's subsequent morticians, even after the original building was torn down and a new one erected in its place, would sometimes find their charges disturbed in a peculiar and specific way. A body, carefully laid out in its coffin, would be found the next morning, with the linen sheet slightly rumpled at its side, and a small, shallow indentation on the pillow next to the deceased's head, as if a small child had, for a time, curled up beside them, seeking a warmth that the living could not provide. The final word on the case of Lucian Graves belongs to the original mortician. In a personal journal discovered only after his death, a journal filled mostly with the dry, factual accounts of his trade, there is a final, undated entry. The handwriting is shaky, the ink faded, but the words are clear. A final testament from the first man to witness the boy's unnatural communion. He wrote, "I have prepared and buried more than 300 souls in my time. I have seen the peace of a good death and the terror of a violent one. I have touched the cold skin of infants and of old men, but none have ever unsettled me to the core of my being like the boy who was not afraid of them. He did not haunt me with visions of terror, but with a single, terrible question that I shall carry with me to my own grave. Did he die? Did he disappear? Or did he simply go home, to join the silent, waiting company of those he had always, for some reason I will never understand, belonged to?" The case file on Lucian Graves is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.